Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers plainclothes officers, reasonable suspicion, and de facto arrests, and is brought to us by Lackluster's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On July 29, 2020, photographer and self-proclaimed gadfly journalist Sean Thomas delivered 4 affidavits to the New York Police Department Transit District
day. I very much enjoy the content.
11 station, which were accepted by Desk Officer Geraldine Diaz without
2
incident.
years, no way.
Approximately 4 months
Why
later,
people
on
happy?
December 2nd, 2020, Mr. Thomas returned to the station to deliver another
Chat, listen
affidavit to
very
Officer
carefully.
Mohammed
Can I
Ashraf,
please
which was
get a
contained in
heart
an
in chat?
unsealed 100 manila envelope labeled with Officer
Happy
Ashraf's
birthday,
name.
Mr. Cow.
I can't do anything. I can't mute, I can't, it's just push out.
XQCOW.
Thanks. The officer's name is on it. Huh?
Where's it coming from?
What? It's for the officer. Just hand it to the officer.
Yeah, but who you? Who you are?
I'm delivering, just a messenger.
Yo. Come over here.
Don't put your hands on me, man.
Yo, they told you to stop.
I don't give a. Don't put
They
your
told you
hands
to
on
stop.
me. I don't care. You don't put your
You
hands
stop.
on me. You don't put your
They
hands
told you
on
to
me.
stop, right?
As Mr. Thomas is leaving the police station, a plainclothes officer grabs his arm and orders him to stop, without identifying himself as a police officer. As the name suggests, plainclothes officers are police officers who wear regular civilian clothing instead of a police uniform. While, in theory, plainclothes officers can be beneficial because they're able to blend in with the general public and prevent crime proactively, New York has a complicated negative history with plainclothes officers. The NYPD's controversial roving plainclothes anti-crime units were disbanded in 2020 by then-Commissioner Dermot Shea after years of civilian complaints that the units regularly used excessive force and disproportionately targeted people of color. According to an article in the New York Times, Commissioner Shea said that, quote,
That's
the
not a red
plainclothes
flag.
units were
Dude,
part of an outdated
Jesus.
policing model that too often seemed to pit officers against the communities they served. Despite the disbandment of the anti-crime units, NYPD continues to use plainclothes officers in its operations. And in early 2022, New York City Mayor, former police officer Eric Adams, vowed to reinstate the anti-crime units in response to escalating gun violence in the city. While, contrary to popular belief, plainclothes officers generally do not have to disclose their status as an officer, even when asked directly, they normally must identify themselves when stopping an individual or otherwise asserting their authority as an officer. As the Seventh Circuit explained in the 2017 case of Dornbos versus City of Chicago, quote, although some unusual circumstances may justify an officer's failure to identify himself in rare cases, it is generally not reasonable for a plainclothes officer to fail to identify himself when conducting a stop. The court in this case also referred to its 2009 decision of Catlin versus City of Wheaton, where it expressed concern about plainclothes officers failing to identify themselves, but held that, quote, it can be a reasonable tactic where the act of identifying themselves could itself reasonably be thought to have made the situation more dangerous.
Oh no, they fucking
Here,
ate
a
it.
court
There's no
would
shot,
almost
right?
certainly
Not again,
conclude
dude.
that the plainclothes officer was unreasonable in his failure to identify himself as a police officer before physically seizing Mr. Thomas, as there was no evidence that it would have been dangerous for him to do so.
Authority you got.
Come in. Sir, come here.
There you go.
Yo. Come over here, man.
Yo, get your hands
Come
off
on.
me.
Come on.
Hold on, who are you? Who are
I'm a
you?
cop, too.
He's a cop.
I'm a cop,
Identify
too.
yourself.
He's a cop. I'm telling you.
Identify
We're all
yourself.
cops here. We're all cops here.
Get your hands off of me.
Don't do that. We'll put you through.
Yeah,
All
put
right?
me through. Put me
Put you
through.
through.
Put me
Put you
through.
through.
We'll see how that works out.
Just sit down, man.
No, I'm not. I'm not sitting down. I'm not sitting down. That's right. Put me in cuffs. Go ahead. Put me in cuffs.
What's going on? You're
Put
delivering?
me in cuffs. You the sergeant?
Yeah.
You have a
Put your hands down. Don't point at him.
you have an obligation to intervene.
got cuffs.
You have an
Give me cuffs.
affirmative obligation. You got a crime? You got a crime?
I know what you handed me.
You have an obligation.
I
Do you
know
have a
what you
crime?
handed me.
Do you have a crime?
Where did you?
So you don't know if you have a
We don't know. We
crime.
don't
So
know.
you don't know. That's not a reason to detain somebody. Now, why am I being detained?
We don't know.
I want suspicion of the crime. That's not how it works. You get a suspicion of a crime. Give me the suspicion of the crime.
The sergeant informs Mr. Thomas that he is being detained because they do not know what is in the package he delivered. And Mr. Thomas argues that because the officers cannot tell him what crime they suspect him of, they cannot detain him. In general, police officers are not required to articulate a specific crime that they suspect an individual of committing in order to detain them. Rather, as the Supreme Court explained in the 2000 case of Illinois versus Wardlow, quote, an officer may, consistent with the Fourth Amendment, conduct a brief investigatory stop when the officer has a reasonable, articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. Reasonable suspicion is a less demanding standard than probable cause, which is the standard that's required to make an arrest. And it requires a showing considerably less than preponderance of the evidence, which is a standard of proof that equates to a likelihood of at least 51%. In the Wardlow case, the court noted that, quote, nervous, evasive behavior is a pertinent factor in determining reasonable suspicion, and that lawful conduct that is, quote, ambiguous,
I'm sure people use this,
and susceptible
the
of
way
an
it's meant to be
innocent
used.
explanation
Surely.
can give rise to reasonable suspicion that allows officers to, quote, detain the individuals to resolve the ambiguity. Here, Mr. Thomas was not involved in criminal activity, as it's not illegal to deliver documents to a police station without identifying yourself. Yet, given the low standard of evidence required to conduct a Terry stop, it's still very possible that a court would conclude that the officers had reasonable suspicion to detain and investigate Mr. Thomas. It is highly unusual to deliver an envelope to a police department and refuse to explain what's in it or who you are. And given this evasive behavior, the officers may have suspected that Mr. Thomas was attempting a chemical weapon attack, or that there was some other dangerous substance in the envelope. However, it should be noted that there are also factors that weigh against a finding of reasonable suspicion, such as the fact that the envelope was unsealed and visibly only contained pieces of paper. So it's challenging to predict with any certainty how a court would rule in this situation, particularly because the holding could vary depending on which court reviewed the case.
We're gonna check your pocket.
You don't have to search my pocket.
Yes, you're not
That's
custody
Fourth
now.
Amendment violation. I'm in your custody. I'm in your custody.
All
I'm
right, you know
lawfully in
what?
your custody.
You know what?
And you have an obligation to intervene. You're
I'm
personally
asking
liable.
you who you are.
I don't give a what you're asking. What obligation am I under to answer your question?
All right, so we don't know what's in here. We're asking you what it is. You are the one bringing this here.
That's right.
Exactly. So
That's right.
Why are you bringing here? We asked the questions here because you came into our
I'm
place.
under no lawful obligation to answer your question.
Obviously, you
I am. What law? Cite the law that I'm obligated to answer your question.
you're not-
Cite it. Set the and cite it.
I'll tell you, it's simple. We brought this here.
Yeah.
We need to know what it is.
Okay, fine. What crime have I committed? What crime have
We're
I
about to
committed?
find out. I'll tell you that.
While Mr. Thomas is in handcuffs, the officers search his pockets and eventually discover a knife. It's important to note that even if the officers had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Thomas, returning him to the police station, placing him in handcuffs, and searching his pockets were likely unconstitutional.
Somebody who delivers a package has a knife? Dude, no shot.
Violations of his Fourth Amendment
No
rights. In the 1983
shot,
case
dude.
of Florida versus Royer, the Supreme Court held that, quote, Terry and its progeny created only limited exceptions to the general rule that seizures of the person require probable cause to arrest. Detentions may be investigative, yet violative of the Fourth Amendment absent probable cause. In the name of investigating a person who is no more than suspected of criminal activity, the police may not carry out a full search of the person, or of his automobile or other effects. Nor may the police seek to verify their suspicions by means that approach the conditions of arrest. In other words, even if officers do not formally arrest an individual, an investigatory stop can ripen into a de facto arrest if the detention is sufficiently intrusive. And if officers do not have probable cause for an arrest, then a de facto arrest is unconstitutional. As the Second Circuit explained in the 2004 case of U.S. versus Vargas, when determining whether a Terry stop has ripened into a de facto arrest, the Second Circuit, which includes New York, considers, quote, the amount of force used by the police, the need for such force, and the extent to which an individual's freedom of movement was restrained, and in particular, such factors as the number of agents involved, whether the target of the stop was suspected of being armed, the duration of the stop, and the physical treatment of
hard shell tacos, man.
the suspect, including whether or not handcuffs were used. According to NYPD procedure number 212-11, although officers may conduct an external frisk for weapons and request consent to search an individual during a Terry stop, they cannot conduct a search without consent. The procedure also states that officers should not transport or otherwise move the suspect from the location where they're stopped unless the suspect consents, or there's an exigency necessitating relocation, such as a hostile crowd or safety threat. Although placing a suspect in handcuffs does not automatically transform a Terry stop into an arrest, when combined with the other circumstances of this situation, it is likely that a court would conclude that Mr. Thomas's detention had ripened into de facto arrest, and that because the officers lacked the probable cause needed to arrest Mr. Thomas before finding the knife, their actions violated the Fourth Amendment.
That's not how it works. You don't detain somebody and then go on a fishing expedition.
You can't just drop a package here and walk out and don't want to answer anything. We got to know what
I tell
you're
you what,
dropping off.
you better have a crime. You better have a crime.
What is dropping off?
You better have a crime.
Who you are, you refuse.
I'm under no obligation to answer your question. What lawful obligation am I under? What lawful obligation am I under to answer your question?
You are off a package.
I concede that. No, what lawful obligation am I under to answer your question?
You want me to accept a packet? Who are you?
What lawful obligation am I under to
Just for
answer
our
your
own
question?
safety. I don't know what's this.
What
is this? What is this? Sir, what is this? What is this?
Open it.
I'm not going to open it. I don't know what is it. Where's your ID that you're a delivery person?
What obligation am I under to
You're supposed to have your ID. If you're a delivery person, you're supposed to expose your ID.
Unlawful search and seizure, you're party to it.
If you,
Your ass is out.
it's all right. Who's this?
As long as you say it's all right.
So do you have any cash on you?
Where's your ID as a delivery person? Where's your ID? You have a delivery ID that you work for a company that you deliver package? I want to see that ID. And I want to call your company and see who you are.
I do not consent to searches and seizures. This is against my will.
After the officers completed their search, Mr. Thomas was taken to a holding cell, where he was held for over 5 hours. After being charged with 1 count of criminal possession of a weapon, Mr. Thomas was eventually released, and the charge against him was later dropped. On December 7th, 2020, Mr. Thomas filed a formal complaint.
Well, no shit. Because if he says that's right, isn't that like a fruit of the poisonous tree? Because if they didn't have the right to search him, right? Because it didn't escalate, then they wouldn't have gotten the knife. So
With the Civilian Complaint Review
how can I charge him with the
Board.
knife
On
if they
October
should have gotten it
13th,
in the first place?
2021, he filed a pro se civil rights lawsuit in the Bronx, New York Supreme Court. As of the date of this episode, both the complaint investigation and the lawsuit are still pending. Overall, the NYPD officers get an F. Because although they may have had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Thomas, they maintained a hostile and combative demeanor throughout the interaction, violated several aspects of department policy, and likely subjected Mr. Thomas to an unconstitutional de facto arrest and search. This is a clear instance of the tactics that led to the disbandment of the NYPD's anti-crime units. And these types of unnecessarily aggressive, unconstitutional encounters work to further alienate the department's officers from the community they're sworn to protect. Nearly every action the officers took in this interaction escalated the situation, which caused Mr. Thomas to become more hostile and less cooperative. Policing is most effective when it's a collaborative effort between the police and the individuals that they serve. And when officers violate the rights of citizens in such an open and unapologetic way, they lose the trust and respect of the community. It appears that Mr. Thomas has a legitimate civil rights claim after this encounter, and it'll be interesting to see whether he can succeed without legal representation. Mr. Thomas gets a B-, because although he demonstrated a clear misunderstanding of the concept of reasonable suspicion and maintained a hostile and combative demeanor throughout the encounter, he verbally invoked his right to remain silent, refused to consent to an unconstitutional search, and took appropriate action after the incident by filing a complaint and a civil rights lawsuit. While Mr. Thomas was not legally required to identify himself or answer the NYPD officers' questions, providing a reasonable amount of information in response to the officers' questions was arguably the most productive way to end this encounter without escalation. If Mr. Thomas had simply explained to the officers that he was delivering an affidavit, then he likely could have dispelled their suspicions without having to identify himself. While Mr. Thomas was not responsible for preventing an unconstitutional police escalation, this interaction highlights the notion that uniformly
it's always like this. Yeah, he was bad, but it doesn't matter how bad people are. If the police doesn't have the right to do something, they shouldn't do it, right? And when they do it, I mean, they go to F. They go to F minus FE.
To remain
That's how it
silent
is.
is not always
That's how it is.
beneficial,
That's how it is.
and it can be helpful.
Guys. When you're a civilian, your job isn't to be smart or good, whatever. You know, it's their job to do the right thing. It's not your job to do the right thing. We're dumb civilians. It is what it is.
Helpful for citizens to provide
Not my job to be smart. It is your job to be smart.
information to dispel reasonable suspicion in certain circumstances. Another important issue to discuss is the fact that while researching this episode, I discovered a 2016 post on Mr. Thomas's Blogspot page suggesting and subjected to various levels of force while attempting to photograph them. And I understand why he would have a negative view of the police based on these encounters. However, advocating violence against other human beings, including police officers, is never acceptable. And I urge Mr. Thomas to reconsider his position on this.
Mr. Thomas, weird champ.